blessing was, connected to volume. I remember through the gas crisis in the, what was that, in the 80s or something? Remember when we got gas lines? And my dad one day was sitting down. My dad was not particular about the food he ate as long as it was soft and warm. Those were his two criteria, right? Soft and warm. And it was a long day for him, right? So he sat down at the table at dinner table, and he, rather than pray his normal prayer, he sat down and he said, "Oh, there's warm food on the plate. There's a full tank of gas, and God is in his temple," he said. And so for my dad, full warm plate, full tank of gas, that's it, that's what we got. So we have this thing that we've linked blessing to abundance. And when did we do that? Paul would say, I'm not linking blessing to abundance, but I'm linking blessing to the ability to collectively hold that which can collectively hold everyone. And that's not abundance. So Paul experiences the blessing that's available when he's able to do that. And those of you who've worked if you've tried going to a homeless shelter and working in a shelter, you've tried to do some of that expanding in your soul, you know what that feels right? To sit down and to feel the balance of what it's like to all have enough to share. Like a balance of enoughness. Like maybe your mantra should be, blessing is enough, right? If there's enough, that's enough. That should be our notion of blessing. And we've distorted it as sort of consumerist, capitalist, individualist thinkers. And Paul is saying there's a blessing in a different place. And I do this slave work and it's great, right? I do the slave work so I can share in the blessing. Wow, that to me is a very powerful statement of how reconciliation works. Then let's look at 2 Corinthians. So then he keeps going, right? And here's how he links it. He says, let's read, I don't want to get too deep into that. Let's just read verse 7, and then I can expand on that other section that I've done. Verse 7. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. So Paul is saying, or advocating, that this enoughness is God's blessing for the world. It is linked to, it's God's work that he's doing. And that when you participate in that moment of this collective shared enoughness, you're participating in the very thing that God is designed to do. And that's where the blessing comes from. It's because that's what God does. And so as you're doing that, you're feeling, oh, this is what God does. God does not let the abandoned drift off to the edges. For God, there is a way to hold everyone, and God then supports everyone. And the understanding Paul gains from this is, I've given you that little diagram with the cross and the empty tomb. That's my little symbol for that. Is that this whole model is revealed to us in the death and resurrection, right? That the one who is seen as least in the social fabric of the day, namely Jesus, who dies as a distasteful sideshow in Roman imperialism, is held up by the holy. And so to participate in this way of being for Paul is living not just the resurrection, as Bruce was saying, but the death and resurrection. And there's a little bit of difference for Paul, right? He's thinking it's not just about resurrection, it's about the cross and the grave, and the empty tomb, I should say. So holding those two things in common, it's about being a slave for all and realizing the blessing in that. That would be cross and empty tomb for Paul. And if you can't hold, I always used to think that you shouldn't be allowed to come to Easter morning service unless you are at Good Friday service. I always used to think there should be I'm sorry, you can't be here. because these two are not, you can't separate. If it's all about Easter, wait a minute. I mean, that's good, but it doesn't capture. Easter is a response to the cross. To be a slave to all is a response to what God's doing in the world. The two are so linked that you can't have one without the other. And we try to get you to understand how they're connected, but oftentimes people come to Easter and say, yeah, it's springtime. I'm sure, it's great, but there. So anyway, that's what Paul's driving at, I think, right? And then finally, so I can move on to we're going to have to fly through this manna stuff, but I think I can. Let's just read verse 15. Yes, everything is for your sake, so that grace, as it extends to more and more people, may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. Do you think you're getting a sense of what Paul's up to as you kind of read this? As this graciousness of God is extended to more and more people, that's thanksgiving. That is God's glory, is the expansion, is the opening of the doors, is the broadening of the beloved community, for lack of a better term. All right? Hopefully, I just wanted you to see that Paul is not just talking the talk. He's actually got a strategy in mind. And the question becomes, as you think about how you live out that strategy in our time, it's going to look a lot different in our time than it did in Paul's time, probably. But what is your strategy? What's your Paul strategy? You should have that at least brewing somewhere in your consciousness. All right, any wisdom to share about that before we shift on to manna economics? All right. The last thing I want to talk about is what some scholars are helping us to wrap our heads around is some of the, and there's part of me that does not agree with this, but it's powerful enough that I think it's important to keep it in front of us. The manna economics is what we're going to talk about. And manna, which means, does anybody know what manna means? Yeah, it literally means, what is this? That's what it actually means. So it means, what is this? Right? That's what manna actually means. What is this economics? That's what this should read, What is this that we're up to, economics, that can sustain the human society? The manna economics model, and here, let me put this first so that you can kind of see why I bring sort of some critical thing to this, is really a birth out of reproducing kind of the hunter-gatherer idealism that the children of Israel experienced before they went to Egypt. So when they went to Egypt, they got into the Egyptian economy, and they, of course, were the slave class in the Egyptian economy, so they got how that economy worked. And when they left Egypt, one of the early stories is the manna in the wilderness, right? It's what do we do about our economic realities if we're not going to have an Egyptian economy that was so abusive for people? So the question is, well, what kind of economy should we create? And really what you see in the manna story is a little bit, well, let's go back to the way it was before we got to Egypt. But the problem is, the world kept moving, right? It was one big, huge empire after another. And in reality, I think we need to create an economics that does not return to a hunter-gatherer model, but bring some of the ideas of manna economics into the economics of our time. So what does that look like for us today in North America? So it's a little idealistic, that's all I'm saying before we get rolling, okay? And let's look at the manna story to learn out. There's four basic themes that you want to get out of this story. Let's start with the first one. Hopefully you're familiar enough with this story that it's kind of fun to look at again. So this Exodus 16, you can go home and look at it if you like in a real Bible, not just on this piece of paper. But I'm just going to pick out different things. The first one is that first underlining. Once they departed from the land of Egypt, so they had left the Egyptian economics behind. So clearly they're in a different kind of setting at this point. They got Moses and Aaron, they're in the wilderness, and what, as they're struggling in the wilderness, what's the first thing that the children of Israel want to do as they're realizing they're not making it out here in the wilderness? You can see it in verse 3. What do they long for?
Where they were.
Yeah. There's something about that Egyptian economics that worked really good because it was full of flesh pots and bread. Could we just go back there? The temptation is to not think creatively. That's what hopefully I'm encouraging you to think. It's not think creatively about the new economy, but to just go back. The other ones seemed to work, at least to put some food in our bellies. And they wanted to just go back to that. But that wasn't what God, in a sense, and Moses had him in mind. So, here's what they had in mind. Verse 4, the Lord says this to Moses, look, notice where does this blessing come from? God says, I'm going to rain bread. So I'm going to rain bread down from heaven for you. And each day, every day, you're going to gather how much?
Enough.
Enough.
Just for the day.
Enough is enough. I think that's the mantra. If you take anything from this class, take this from this class. Enough is enough. That's what they're told to take for each day. Enough. And that's one of the primary rules of manna economics, that each family gets enough for their needs so that no one has too little, which is totally important. There's no bottom, there's no, what would you call it? There's no ability to absorb worse and worse living conditions. No one gets too little, and no one gets too much. That in a God-sized economy, so to speak, there is enoughness is the balancing point. And when you think about your own personal economy, and I've used this to think about mine, when I have money to start storing away in the bank, right, I get really like covetous over that money, because now I'm like, wow, look how much that's making, and then I got another one over here, and I started getting this new relationship to money that I never used to have when I was just had enough to go, well, we were able to survive that week, that's good, So there is something to this that I want to pay attention to. Enough is enough, right? I got to fly through this because we're already at 10:30, so I'm going to at least get you through this so we can move on next week. The next one is, go to the next page, so flip it over, verse 16. That's the one. 16 says, this is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it each of you needs, an omer, a person, according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents. The Israelites did so. Some gathered more, and some gathered less. So it doesn't imply that we all get the same amount. We get what's going to work for your household. So I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. The next one is that you're not allowed to accumulate manna. What happens if you accumulated manna? Does anybody actually remember the old story? I think it's in here, but I don't remember it. What happened to the manna if you accumulated it?
Red worms became hollow.
Yeah, it rots. We don't accumulate. That's not how it works. We always live this balance. And remember, they came from Egypt. Remember, Egypt was the land that's what they did. They accumulated wealth, right? And as wealth grows stagnant and accumulates, it tends to migrate into the hands of the few. And so the whole idea of manna economics is wealth should be like wealth needs to move all the time. Wealth shouldn't sit in one spot. It's got to have some dynamic to it. And so how do you move wealth around so that it does the greatest good? You have enough, but other people have enough. And one of the most powerful mechanisms they used for moving wealth around was a thing called Jubilee. Right? So that at the end of 7 years, and I used to think this is a stupid idea, but the more I think about it, it's actually pretty smart. At the end of 7 years, everybody goes back to what's just enough. So that if in 7 years, I was like cooking, all of a sudden everybody was buying my widgets. And that's great. I mean, everybody needs those widgets. But at the end of the 7 years, I start over, not that I get the rug pulled out from me, but I start over together with you, and a few of us will do really good, and a few of us will struggle, but we'll all manage. Jubilee year, and the Jubilee economics was that we want to keep things certain.